We have come an incredibly long way. If I look around at the amount of robotics and autonomous vehicle activity there was in Australia 10 years ago, when I was a much more junior researcher, versus now, there's orders of magnitude more opportunities. And it's not just in academia, it's in startups, it's in in-house tech departments in large companies. There's more coverage of it across most of the states as opposed to just one state potentially leading it early on. So it is pretty amazing how far we've come. And if you look back and try and sort of attribute credit to it, I think it's a mixture of everyone being involved. It's government waking up to the fact that these are important things to investigate and resource. It's a lot of very passionate people like yourself and many others being involved in it and pushing it.
Hi, Smart Community friends. In this episode of the Smart Community Podcast, I have a wonderful chat with Michael Milford. Michael is a multi-award-winning educational entrepreneur, professor, and joint director at the Queensland University of Technology, QUT, Centre for Robotics. Michael conducts interdisciplinary research at the boundaries between robotics, neuroscience, and computer vision. I spoke with Michael in both 2018 and 2020, so I'm super excited to welcome him back for Mobility May. In this episode, Michael begins by telling us about his background as a professor and joint director at the QUT Centre of Robotics, his passion for technology, specifically for autonomous vehicles, as well as education, and Michael then tells us about what a smart community means to him. Michael then updates us on some of the projects he's been working on since we last recorded in 2020, including two parts of the Cooperative and highly automated driving project he's been leading for QUT. Before he discusses some of the use cases where autonomous vehicles are an advantage and a disadvantage to society. We finish our chat discussing the emerging trends of computer vision, perception, sensing, and decision-making in the artificial intelligence space, as well as having a more grounded approach to developing autonomous vehicles. As always, we hope you enjoy listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.
Welcome to the smart community, smart regions, smart towns, and smart cities. It's where we live, work, and play. With smart communities, the future starts today. Big data, smart mobility, emerging trends galore. The Smart Community Podcast is what you're looking for.
Hello, Michael. How are you today?
Hey, Zoe. I'm great. Thanks for having me on the podcast.
I'm so excited to have you back on. I actually didn't even look the last time you were on, but you've been on at least twice. So this is your third time. So welcome back. We are in Mobility May because, truth be told, March was too hectic and I couldn't get around to doing Mobility March. So here we are in May. I'm excited to have you back on. So let's just jump straight in, and can you tell us about your background and what you're passionate about?
Sure. So I'm a professor at QUT in robotics and joint director of the QUT Centre for Robotics, which is one of those large research centres doing everything robotics, autonomous vehicles, and AI in Brisbane at QUT. I am very passionate about all those technical topics, but especially the area of autonomous vehicles, the technical development behind what might make them a reality, but also, just as importantly, the societal aspect of how these technologies could deploy in our cities, what sort of preparation we might need to do, and how we can best sort of educate and excite the public about the potential benefits, and also make them healthily cautious and skeptical about some of the potential downsides as well.
Yeah, and I would say, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're very passionate about education. That be right?
Yes. From the youngest age possible, I like to start getting into kids' heads about all these amazing technologies and get them aware of what they could bring to their future lives.
Yeah, and I think it's really important because then they can start questioning them too, because they don't have that filter, right? I recently spoke at QUT at a Engineering Your Future Day, and the questions that they ask are just amazing. And they haven't been pushed by society yet to, don't ask that, these type of things. And so if you get them talking about these technologies, they can ask those hard questions that we as adults might not ask.
Oh, it's that quote from the mouth of babes is very appropriate. You'll be sauntering through one of these Q&A sessions, and then out of left field, this amazingly perceptive question will just surprise you. And you have to stop and pause for a moment, because not only can the question be quite confronting or probing, but you also have to consider the audience in terms of how you answer it. In an informal adult audience, you might have a more cynical, sort of flippant answer, but that's definitely not appropriate when you're talking with younger kids.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's go broad and then we're going to dive into some of the projects. Tell us what a smart community means to you.
Oh, wow. So a smart community means a couple of things to me. The first thing is that it is literally smart. And so all the key stakeholders and end users in that community are very well informed and savvy about all the goings on and workings of that smart community. So that could be the technology. It could be flying cars or autonomous vehicles or connected mobility, whatever the topic is. But then they're also savvy and understanding of the impact and benefits and downsides of these technologies to not just themselves, but all the other key stakeholders in the environment. And they're able to have a nice reasoned discussion about the pros and cons that isn't fed by, I guess, misinformation or misconceptions about what is happening with these technologies, but is very much grounded in the reality of what is actually happening, and therefore is much more likely to be productive in terms of how these communities develop over time.
I really like that. Bring it back. Again, we know we're always talking about bringing it back to the people. You working in the tech space, but it's actually about people being informed about whatever's happening around. Because when you're informed, you can also then input into the conversation as well to then shape what it actually looks like. And I think in terms of autonomous vehicles and all these other things happening, we need to, like you said, actually let people know what the benefits are or develop the benefits together. Like what can they actually be if we go down certain paths, but then also those downsides. But it's not a this or that. It's actually a discussion and a conversation. I know that you're really passionate also about having those debates and having those discussions. I've seen you on panels and on stages. And I think that is really important when we are more and more living in a world where we're just polarized by it has to be either that or that. So I think that is really important too.
Yeah, and you have to set up the right environment, because polarization can be a safe space perversely, because it's much easier to have a very extreme black and white opinion on something than it is to have a nuanced, messy discussion. This also permeates, I guess, politics, right? It's very difficult to get across nuanced points in politics when you have a 3-second spiel, particularly topical at the moment. But it is really critical. And so you want to make sure as many people, even the people behind the scenes, are able to have those sort of more nuanced takes and perspectives, because that is going to be, what ultimately guides us the best into the future, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree. I was just going to have a look and see what last time we spoke was, and when, like, at what point in your work we were. Let me have a look. Okay, March 2020. So we were, really? No, surely not.
That might have been the last formal podcast we did together. We've probably been on panels or something since then.
True, we have, but that's so surprising. Because you came on, you were actually episode 22, which I loved, because we were also talking about like children and robots and all these type of things. And then, we did an autonomous vehicle update. So I guess a lot's happened since 2020, March 2020. And we're also, I think we either recorded just before the lockdowns happened, because it was the 2nd of March. So it's been a wild kind of couple of years. So let's go to the projects and things that you've been working on, knowing that, we had an update in about early 2020.
Sure. So I think we've actually had some new projects in that space start. So one of them is we now midway through a project with Ford Motor Corporation. And so that's working on, it's a technical project. It's working on the technology around mapping and positioning systems for autonomous vehicles. And that's been fantastic, because we've been able to work on a sort of weekly basis with one of the leading automotive companies in the world. And it's now public. I couldn't talk about it for a while, but it's now public. There's been some media releases around it. So that's been really exciting. And that has also been part of a growing collaboration between not just our little specific project, but a number of Australian universities have been working with companies like Ford for many years now. And it's really great for the technical ecosystem in Australian academia for that to be the case. So that's really exciting. As with all industry projects, they're limited in what you can say. But one of the things that is always true is that when you go from the abstract scientific academic research world and you try and make these things work in the real world, that I got my plug in for my university, nothing ever works. And so all the ingenuity and interest and insight is from looking at this massive disconnect between, I guess, the research community, which does amazing stuff, but a lot of the stuff is not ready out of the box for showtime in the real world, so to speak. And so that's always interesting. It's been particularly interesting and eye-opening on this project, which has been really, really exciting.
Yeah, cool. What types of things are you actually doing? If, for a layperson's listening to this, they don't know a lot about autonomous vehicles, what will that outcome of that project actually be?
Sure. So to the level that I can talk about it, we are working on mapping and positioning systems for autonomous vehicles. So an autonomous vehicle, obviously there's the hardware component. It has all the sensors and the computers on board, but then there's the algorithms, the artificial intelligence side of things, which makes it drive sensibly like a human, hopefully even better than a human. And so there's a lot of components of the artificial intelligence. There's the idea of the car being able to recognize what is in the world around it. So pedestrians, cyclists, other vehicles, the road, the lines, all that sort of stuff. And then another key component is positioning. So you would use positioning when you use your smartphone to help you navigate across town. So that's one type of positioning. Then you have sort of more sophisticated levels of positioning, which is what enables the car to stay within its lane, to turn the corner without mounting the curb or veering into the other lane, and to have an understanding of where it's driving and what sort of hazards might be in the environment around it. And so we're working on those more sophisticated aspects of positioning, and we're working on it from in a primarily a visual context. So these autonomous vehicles, they have radar, they have cameras as sensors, they have LiDAR, which is a very sophisticated sensor that tells you how far away things are. And so we're working primarily using the camera information. Cameras are very attractive for autonomous vehicle companies because they're arguably sort of the richest sensor. So when you look at what a camera shows you, it's what a human sees in the world. And so theoretically, and this is, I think, what Elon Musk's argument partly is, you could do almost everything in autonomous driving just with cameras, although most companies are also using those other sensors.
Is a camera, would that be then like a harder or just a bigger load to compute, or have we solved that problem?
No, the compute is a perennial question, and Murphy's Law is basically as computers get more and more capable, the engineers and scientists find ways to basically max them out. It has happened continually for decades and decades, but that's not quite true. So you can now run very sophisticated modern artificial intelligence using cameras, for example, on board on a typical autonomous vehicle because it has extremely powerful computers on board. And those computers are they're not as expensive as they used to be. And so the big graphics cards companies and CPU companies like Intel and NVIDIA and these other companies have pivoted some of their manufacturing processes to make computer hardware that is optimized for things like autonomous driving and for things like modern artificial intelligence techniques. So it's got substantially better, substantially cheaper, substantially more capable, even over the last sort of 4 or 5 years. So it is a consideration, but it's no longer a sort of deal breaker for making the technology work.
And is urban canyoning still an issue, or do you augment that with the cameras and other types of ground, kind of positioning devices?
Sure. So urban canyoning is definitely still an issue. It's not an intractable issue. When you're navigating across town and you just need to know roughly where you are and roughly where the destination is, if your GPS or your positioning system drops out for a second or two, it's usually not critical. Where it is critical is for those things like staying within your lane, driving correctly locally within your local environment. And in those cases, you definitely wouldn't rely on a sensor like GPS alone because for exactly the reasons you say, things like urban canyoning, where you get multipath reflections, screw your positioning estimate from the GPS. And so if you're driving just on that, you would probably drive onto the footpath. But no one does that. Everyone uses these other positioning systems that use cameras and LiDAR and other sensors. But they use GPS as well. It's just they don't rely on it.
Yeah, fair. A couple of questions. I want to talk about some of the use cases you see where autonomous vehicles will be of benefit, and then also some of the downsides. But I also want to talk briefly, if you can, about the CHAD project and whether has that been completed and some of your key outcomes for that. So Maybe we'll talk about the project first, and then, if you can, and then benefits and disbenefits before we go to the future.
Sure. So myself and my team have had a role on leading 2 projects as part of CHAD, but that's just one tiny fraction of the entire CAVI and CHAD project that is run by iMove and Department of Transport and Main Roads Queensland and many other partners. The 2 projects we did, the first one was we created a non-autonomous but otherwise very similar to an autonomous vehicle car and took it on a 1,200 kilometre road trip around southeast Queensland. And we were evaluating, were all the algorithms that do sign detection, traffic light detection, lane detection, were they ready for game time in Australia? And if not, what needed to change? That project had really 2 key outcomes. One was that most of these systems are obviously trained for overseas conditions, European or American environments. And so they don't know about all the sign peculiarities in Queensland or Australia. So that was one issue. And the second issue was simply that to get sufficient performance out of the systems, we had to go to the use of high definition maps. So the basic idea is you have these very high quality prior maps of the environment. So when the car's driving through it, assuming it knows where it is in the environment, which is where positioning comes in again, it's able to refer to that map and get all sorts of extra information beyond what it's just seeing right at that moment in time with its sensors. And so those are the key findings of that project. So that led to the second project that we completed more recently, which was on, okay, high definition maps are quite likely going to be a critical part of any autonomous vehicle solution. How is everyone doing or attacking this problem around the world? And so we reached out and talked to a number of companies and organizations and also did a very extensive review of how high definition maps were being attacked in Europe, in Asia, and in the Americas. And it was really interesting to see things around what are the standards being developed around high definition maps, main critical issues like how do you create the maps, but then how do you update and maintain the maps? How do councils or government agencies that conduct roadworks, for example, how do they communicate that to the map providers so that rather than the autonomous vehicle stumbling upon the roadworks and discovering it, it already knows about it ahead of time? And so it was really fascinating and also quite illuminating to see the depth to which some overseas countries had attacked this problem and were even doing trials. And of course, we've done some trials. There have been some trials locally on connected vehicles as well. Generally speaking, Europe seemed to be the leader on the regulatory standards type side of things, not necessarily in terms of developing the core autonomous vehicle technology, where you could argue America is still king or queen, but in terms of regulating communication between infrastructure and vehicles, Europe had done a lot of work. And it's probably likely that Australia will heavily, not necessarily adopt, but reference those other countries' work in this area as we develop our own systems here.
Yeah, cool. That's super interesting because I think that's one of the key parts of, I guess, autonomous vehicles in general is, well, the high definition maps, but just bringing that global knowledge and then working out what is it that we're going to do here in Australia. I also want to mention, you're sitting here in Brisbane in Queensland and you're doing some world-leading research and work. I think that's really exciting. I think maybe we don't talk about that enough as well.
Yeah, it's easy to sort of just incrementally go through your career and then not reflect back, right? That's why panels and dinners and stuff are a good opportunity to do that. But you're very much right. And I have tried to deliberately reflect on the state of tech in Australia. So obviously we are still a minnow compared to powerhouses like, I won't even say the US, I'll say like California, for example. But we have come an incredibly long way. If I look around at the amount of robotics and autonomous vehicle activity there was in Australia 10 years ago, when I was a much more junior researcher, versus now, there's orders of magnitude more opportunities. And it's not just in academia, it's in startups, it's in in-house tech departments in large companies. There's more coverage of it across most of the states as opposed to just one state potentially leading it early on. So it is pretty amazing how far we've come. And if you look back and try and sort of attribute credit to it, I think it's a mixture of everyone being involved. It's government waking up to the fact that these are important things to investigate and resource. It's a lot of very passionate people like yourself and many others being involved in it and pushing it, even if it wasn't necessarily aligned with the conventional career path that they were being told to follow. And if you mix all of that together, I think that's the reason why we're where we're at. What's really interesting is whether we can keep that trajectory going, right? One of the problems with growth is it's very easy to get the initial growth, but then to sustain it as you get into scaling issues is more challenging. And I'm interested to sort of think about, beyond the scope of this conversation, but what would that level of scaling continued for another 5 years look like in Australia?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess that does lead nicely into thinking about some of those use cases, those key use cases. I've been thinking a lot about this lately. Like kind of, I was saying in the pre-chat, autonomous vehicles were this hot topic in just the mainstream, and obviously we were kind of embedded in it, but it was still kind of, hot. Whereas now maybe we're not talking about it as much. There's some drone talk, there's some other things happening. Obviously you've got your hype curve, which I know you have some thoughts about as well. But let's talk about some specific use cases for where autonomous vehicles will actually benefit society.
Sure. So the backdrop to all of this is that the primary motivation that has been driving the money behind this is this holy commercial grail of widespread, fully autonomous level 4 or 5 robo-taxis everywhere, and certain companies basically not necessarily monopolizing, but really capturing a large part of that market and earning the initial figures of trillions of dollars. So everyone has stepped back from that as being realistic in any time in the future. It's reassuring that everyone says we're not exactly sure when all of this will happen, but that only goes so far. Eventually, people will start getting frustrated when people stop giving any predictions and just throw their hands up in the air and say, well, we don't know, but it will take a long time. I think the fascinating thing now is there's an opportunity here in that as the shine has come off that very ambitious goal of ubiquitous autonomous vehicles everywhere, other applications which would more immediately benefit parts of society become more attractive and more feasible. And that they become more attractive and more feasible for multiple reasons. First of all, people aren't off necessarily chasing unrealistic trillion-dollar paydays. And so they might consider more mundane business plays, providing a very limited autonomous vehicle service in a retirement community, or as a last-mile transport solution in a new housing development, or to people who otherwise couldn't drive, which might not actually make a lot of money, or may even be moderately subsidized by local councils or transport operators. But they do that already for public transport, right? So it's not inconsistent from an ideological point of view. The other aspect is a lot of the talent which has been attracted by this ridiculous level of money is starting to come back into these other domains. So Australia, even in the last 18 months, has had a lot of the top young talent from the autonomous vehicle space come back. And they're finding homes in sort of universities or in applied research organizations or at a number of the startups operating in this space. So it's not just that these other applications that are perhaps not as exciting to the venture capitalists, but would have immediate benefit. It's not just that those are becoming more feasible from a sort of appetite perspective, but you now have access to people who can make it a reality. That's, of course, there's more people being trained through degrees like mechatronics as well. So that's helping add to the talent pool. So I think those more mundane but more immediately beneficial applications, there's a lot of potential there. There's major events like the Olympics. There's major societal issues like the aging challenge in Australia, giving people mobility out of their own homes for as long as possible. All of these things are providing a nice level of opportunity and gentle pressure in the background. That means some of these more immediately realizable autonomous vehicle related plays could become a reality sort of in the short, medium term, which is really exciting.
Yeah, I've been thinking a bit about this around obviously the city kind of concept. There's lots of people, there's lots of things, lots of weird things that happen in cities, like people step out or do this or go the wrong way or whatever. Cars doing U-turns in front of you. There's kangaroos, maybe not in the city. Sometimes there are, you never know. Sometimes there are. But like this highway driving between like the rural kind of or remote or more like that longer kind of aspect. Do you see that if we focus there that you could have that fully autonomous kind of section of the road or like section of our journey that could be fully autonomous if that's what we're focused on?
Yeah, of course. And there are reasonably convincing arguments that some of the autonomous vehicle technology you can buy today is perhaps safer, or at least approaching the safety level of a human driver on highway environments only, obviously not in a complicated city. The real challenge there is making the benefit case stack up. And so one of the great things about Australia is that our per capita road toll is very low, one of the lowest in the world, as I understand it, substantially lower than the United States, for example, which means that for there to be substantial safety benefits, it's a good problem to have, but for there to be substantial safety benefits, you really need to get fairly widespread penetration of the technology. My understanding is that in certain transport sectors, rural accident rates are higher per capita or per kilometre driven. And so there's more potential upside there. But once again, you have to be careful not to push the technology. So there's companies like Seeing Machines and other companies doing sort of not full autonomy, but assistive technology. And it's possible, fatigue monitoring technology. And it's possible that those initial technologies will be easier to implement and will have just as much beneficial impact. Once again, rural areas, potentially providing local public transport mobility solutions in rural areas, you might be able to get to the point where a limited local autonomous shuttle service is actually maybe subsidized but viable. And that would be really exciting for providing mobility where there was no options before. And I know RSCQ did some trials in sort of relatively remote communities recently along that line of motivation.
I often think, though, we could have that service now if we really wanted to. There would just be someone driving it, right? And so it's like, how much of that benefit is not having someone driving, or is it all these other things where it's like, well, one, I think increasing awareness of technology, particularly in rural areas, is really important, because then now the world is our oyster, right? We can work and live from anywhere if we've got a strong internet connection. But then it also pushes people to ask for more in terms of connectivity and all those type of things as well. But I do often think like that, if that service was really viable and we could focus on it, then you could pay somebody to drive the bus and go around. But it is an interesting kind of, you need then a government to be able to say, yes, this is really important over these other things. So,
And just on that, I think it's important to note, we're not talking about a super expensive instrumented, slick Tesla robotaxi type thing. The cost price for some of these limited autonomy shuttle solutions continues to drop. And the other key advantage they have, especially in remote communities, and this applies to agriculture and other areas, is labor availability. So the vehicle might not be particularly capable, it might not be particularly fast, it might have a limited area it can operate, but theoretically you could have near 100% availability. And if the vehicle is not that expensive to commission and buy, and if it has sort of a low maintenance cycle, and if it has a 10, 15-year lifetime, the numbers start to stack up even compared to the human driver. You're very much right that the first question should always be with autonomy, does it actually make sense, or are you better off just employing a person? And obviously there's employment benefits there. But I think we may start to see it reaching a tipping point just in terms of the raw numbers for some of these specific use cases. And that's something I'm interested in talking with people more about into the future.
No, I like that. Thank you. We want to zoom to the future now. Well, soon. I just want to some of the key disbenefits that people talk about and that you're seeing in this space.
Key benefits of what? Autonomous vehicles or in general?
Disbenefits. What are the things that we need to really be...
Oh, bad things. Disbenefits.
Yes. Is that even the word? Did I just make that up?
I think you just coined a new word. You should go check Urban Dictionary, and if there's no entry, you should...
The disadvantages. What are some of the disadvantages of autonomous vehicles or potential?
So I think we've touched on some of these previously, but there's obviously this is primarily driven by economics at the moment. And so there's the chance that the vehicles are deployed and targeted at areas and people where they're going to make the most money. And the very obvious many disadvantages, but the key one is that it exacerbates inequity and provides a service to well-off people and makes the mobility problem even worse for those who can't afford it. So that's one of the obvious ones. The other ones, of course, around health. So everyone focuses on preventing accidents, but there have been a number of studies that speculate with some reasonable data that if people started jumping in cars all the time, things like heart disease and other things might go up. The people who are city planners or cyclist aficionados or walkable city fans who are listening to this podcast are probably just about to tear my head off, but it's worth pointing out that even if autonomous vehicles work really well, there are lots of other ways to fix mobility solutions in cities, including walkable cities, non-vehicle transport, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's a chance that you might solve autonomous vehicles and it would still not be the best thing to do for the city and the people in it. So that's just a smattering of the many, many potential issues. I think on the positive side, I think people are relatively well versed on most of these. And so I think the key stakeholders, the key decision makers, they won't necessarily make the decisions we agree with, but they will be relatively aware of most of these key issues, which is a good change from even 5 years ago.
Yeah, we've kind of gone past that like hype you were talking about with fully autonomous, ubiquitous vehicles, etc. Yes, thanks for bringing that. I was actually also going to bring that up because I know that I would also, people be like, what about walking and cycling? Which obviously I'm doing Mobility May, I've got lots of people talking about that. But yes, I totally agree. It's a combination and it's a good planning and walkable neighborhoods and all those things, but it needs to fit in with, we can't ignore the technology because it's there, it's happening, and we know that. So it's actually a mixture. And yeah, I think that's really important.
And there's a tantalizing reverse situation where obviously it's very hard to change large-scale infrastructure overnight. These are multi-decadal projects, right? So if, say, autonomous vehicle technology really develops and improves, you could imagine a situation where AVs are an interim solution to city design problems, which are deployed in road-dominated cities for 10, 20, 30 years, but then eventually transition to non-road-based, non-car-based. That's very speculative, but you could imagine a scenario where that might happen.
Well, that's good fodder for the future. Let's move to the future now. What are the emerging trends that people aren't talking about enough?
The ones that people aren't talking about. So the ones that people are talking about are the fact that everyone's taking a step back, and that in the autonomous vehicle space, there's been a lot of consolidation and there's a much smaller number of players taking a much more patient long-term approach to it. But I think that's reasonably well known. I think the things that people aren't talking about or are just about to start about in the artificial intelligence space are particularly significant. There are still pretty radical advances being made in the AI space relating to things like computer vision and perception and sensing and decision making. Obviously, a lot of that applies strongly to autonomous vehicles. And so some of that may make a transformative difference to the capabilities of the vehicles, or if you're a cynic, it won't, but it will incrementally improve it. I think one of the ironies here is that as the hype dies down around autonomous vehicles, you're probably seeing the most healthy, grounded, realistic investment and development in autonomous vehicles by the small number of companies doing it. So one of the things I like about the hype curve is that I think sometimes when the least people are talking about a technology is when it makes that critical transition from being not viable to viable. To be clear, I'm not predicting that for autonomous vehicles, but I would say that's more likely now than it would have been 3 or 4 years ago, just because people are taking a much more sensible, grounded approach to developing them now.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it also, like that realistic element of it, I just find sometimes with the hype, it's then damaging to, viable technologies that could actually be good, but people go, oh, it's all just hype, forget about it. And so there's just like lots of money being poured in, but not a lot of tangible outcomes, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas now it's like, okay, what is the real use case? What are the real benefits, et cetera? And getting those over the line, I think, is important.
Yeah, and people talk about in academia who work in computer science, they talk about these artificial intelligence or AI winters that occurred in sort of the 80s or 90s where the AI field was massively hyped and then failed to deliver. And people have speculated, will there be an autonomous vehicle winter? I think we've already seen enough of a dialing back of expectation to see that it is going to scale back a bit in terms of hype, but more gracefully than has been done in past technology booms. And so I think it won't necessarily be a gentle landing, but I don't think it's going to be as catastrophic a pullback, especially since there are other commercial applications in mining and defense and agriculture where a lot of this technology could pivot to.
Well, Michael, it's been so great to chat with you again. I feel like, yes, we could definitely talk for a lot longer, and we'll have to catch up in 3D. I'll come have a coffee at QT sometime soon. But yeah, thanks again for joining me on the podcast for Mobility May. Thanks for sharing your knowledge as always. And I'm just keen to ask you one more question, which is how can people connect with you?
Sure. So you can hit me up on Twitter at MathThrills. You can look me up on Google. I'm smattered all over Google, or you can drop me an email at michael.milford@qut.edu.au.
Excellent. Now, just before you go, tell us about your book quickly, your new book.
So we just released our new book, The Complete Guide to Autonomous Vehicles for Kids, ... and everyone else. And we're really excited about it. It's getting a lot of great feedback. It's a complete visual guide to everything autonomous vehicles. It's like 120 pages long, and it gets into some of the nitty-gritty details. So it's for older kids, sort of 10 and ages above, but also just as much for adults. And I didn't even tell you this before, but I'd be happy to sort of work out a giveaway of 1 or 2 books to your listeners, but we can work that out later on.
Let's do that. We'll have some kind of fun competition. Cool. Let's do that. I'm excited. You're excited. We'll put all the links in the show notes, but we'll also have a chat about how we can give away some of those books. That would be awesome. Well, thanks, Michael, again, and I look forward to chatting to you again soon.
Cheers, Zoe. Thanks for having me on. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
The Smart Community podcast is brought to you by My Smart Community. If you're trying to deal with disruption, not sure what technologies to buy, need to facilitate genuine collaboration, then we can help. Email hello@mysmart.community or head to www.mysmart.community/consulting.
Thanks so much for listening to the Smart Community podcast. Show notes for this episode and all other episodes are available on our website, mysmart.community/podcast. If you have any questions for us or any of our guests, you can email hello@mysmart.community. You can also find us on the socials. We are on LinkedIn and Twitter @SmartComHQ. That's com with 2 M's. If you are enjoying the podcast, please hit subscribe so you never miss an episode. And we would love for you to leave us a rating and review at wherever you listen. This really helps us reach more ears and eyes, so thank you for your support. As always, we hope you enjoyed listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.
The Smart Community Podcast is what you're looking for.